Dawn ran a thin pewter edge along the roofs of Red Hollow, the kind of light that makes a town look honest whether it wants to or not. Ropes held Elias Vane and Sheriff Roar to the church rail beneath a bell, scarred by 100 funerals and 3 weddings, and every window along the square watched like an eye that had finally remembered how to open. Brin leaned warm against Martha's calf, his flank bandaged with a strip of her old shawl, breath steady as a smith's bellows. Adeline checked the oilcloth bundle for the 3rd time. The ledger pressed flat between 2 charcoal rubbings, one of the pipes stamp ELV and Co., the other of the crude tunnel map with its X marks and numbers, and when she looked up, Clara Whitmore was already crossing the dust with her coat buttoned and a face that had been carved overnight into purpose. Mrs. Kendricks came from the alley with a dented canteen and a voice that had learned to apologize before it spoke. For the dog, she said, and for the woman who found what men pretended wasn't there. Martha drank cool metal against a dry lip, then tipped the rest into a little dish for Brin. His tongue made careful sounds in the quiet like someone turning the pages of a thin book. Around them, the town made room, not stepping back out of suspicion, but stepping aside in the particular way people do when they have decided a thing must pass through them, and it will be better if they do not block it. A barefoot boy ran in from the ridge road, hair a banner chest heaving. Lights in the shack, he panted. Like stars fell through the floor. Metal tapping, a hammer's talk. Jacob Harrow's jaw found a new angle. They'll wedge the bleed and jump the pressure, he said, voice low. Foul the town draw or pop a seam so the tunnel drowns its own proof. Clara turned her eyes to Vane, who wore the kind of small smile a man wears when he still believes dust can be taught to bow. We split, Clara said, her words landing like pegs. Jacob, lock the square and sit on our 2 snakes. Mr. Reed, Mr. Talbot, telegraph office now. We put our story on the wire to the governor's clerk, the circuit judge, and the marshal 2 towns north. Martha Adeline back to the ridge. Steady the flow, keep the proof dry, and bring back whatever their haste leaves behind. She didn't bother to ask about the dog. Brin had already pointed his nose toward the wet breath lifting from the hill. Thin wrist-bound shame, written in blunt letters across his face, cleared his throat. The bleed's in the east wall, he said. A thin slot where a sliver can starve the townside. Countervalve sits half a turn upstream. If they've hammered a wedge, you'll need 2 hands, one to ease, one to pull, or the stream will buck like a spooked colt. Clara studied him for a breath, then sliced the rope that linked his wrist to his belt, leaving them tied but usable. Earn your say, she told him. Live to give it. They took 2 hooded lanterns, a coil of hemp, a crowbar, and a tin of lard for metal that forgot its manners. Martha slid her sewing roll into her pocket without thinking. Habit is a small shield you can carry anywhere. The climb scraped their lungs, but did nothing to their pace. At the shack, the crooked door pulsed a slow yellow, with each draft like a sick lung. Adeline pinched the lantern shades until their circles of light were tight as fists. The trapdoor sighed open. Cool rose to meet them, a wet sweetness that filled Martha's throat with a hurt as clean as relief. The stream's voice had changed since yesterday, clipped impatient as if someone had shoved it in the ribs. Brin took the ladder in tidy clicks and waited at the bottom until Martha's boots found packed earth. Finn pointed with his bound hands. Down 2 bends, he whispered. Listen first. They heard it before they saw it. A rattle under water's whisper, metal choking on metal. Around the curve, 2 foreign lanterns burned on crates. A lean man knelt by the far wall, had off sleeves, rolled a wrench laid across a brass throat of pipe, one hand, stroking a gauge's glass the way a man calms a skittish horse. He spoke without turning. You could have left it, he said. Towns die, cattle thin. Folks follow the river as far as it still remembers itself. Pipe's the only spine left out here. He twisted. The needle trembled. The stream hiccuped. Brin's growl started low and traveled into the floorboards of the earth. The man smiled sideways without warmth. Easy dog. Then he looked up and saw Adeline. First Martha, second Finn, third. The smile shortened to string. Traitor, he said to Finn. Turn it back, Martha said, and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her as if she'd just found a straight seam under poor light. Foul the well, and you foul your own mouth. There's enough rot in this valley. Don't ladle more. The man's fingers tightened. I count, he said. Numbers don't cry when you carry them. The wrench gave the valve a small, cruel kiss. Somewhere behind Martha's memory of clapboard and stove smoke, a hidden pipe would be shuddering in a wall, water gulping air and air gulping water. Adeline set her lantern on the crate and lifted the coil. There's law on the wire, she said, voice level enough to teach by. You talk, now you walk later. You hide, now rock keeps you. He snorted. Mercy from a school teacher. The snort died when Brin moved no bark, just a silent arrow of muscle and teeth into boot leather. The wrench skittered, shrieking against stone. Finn threw his shoulder wrists, still tied into the man's ribs. All four hit the dirt. The gauge's needle jumped and then sulked. Martha went still the way a room goes still when a child is sleeping in it. She saw the shape of the wrong wedge in the east slit starving the townside while swelling the hidden reservoir like a belly about to split. Adeline, she said, hold the countervalve when I say. Slow, not all at once. She slid to the seam where a stub of pipe bit into rock. A waxy plug glistened pale in the lantern light. From it jutted a thin iron sliver set at a mean angle. She touched it and it bit her through the glove. She greased her fingertips with lard, took the smallest needle from her roll, threaded a chalk twine, and sent the needle like a question into the crack. The twine fluttered in her fingers, tugging like the breath of something frightened. It'll cut you, Finn warned, knee on the gauge man's shoulders. Better a cut than a drowned town, Martha said. Pull, she told Adeline. Adeline set both hands to the countervalve and leaned with the kind of patient strength learned by holding rooms together more than once. The needle bobbed. The twine settled. Martha teased the wedge of fingernails width. The stream's hiss eased, found a lower note. Again, Martha breathed and Adeline obliged, and Martha worked by feel, layered and twine and breath, in a seam that wanted to stay wrong until the sliver let go, with a tiny stubborn click and lay in her palm like a bad tooth finally pulled. Water evened, deepened, remembered its own song. Brin let go, shook himself, once proud as a banner-finding win. Adeline caught Martha's wrist, turned her palm so the lantern could read it. A blood bead stood where metal had kissed skin. Adeline's thumb pressed it away. We keep the room steady, she murmured. They can't spin a flood out of a river that runs true. They bound the gauge man with the same rope he'd hoped to wrap around Red Hollow's throat. His eyes kept flicking to the gauge as if it were a clock counting down to a salvation only he'd been promised. Adeline's knot sat neat and final across his wrists. Names, she said. Who stamped the metal, who swung the purse, who placed the orders. His jaw twitched twice like a man choosing which of two rotten apples to bite. Press in the rail sheds east of the Capitol, he said at last. Stamp reads ELV & Co. Men with office keys look the other way. Vein keeps paper clean. Roar keeps folks scattered, I measure. Martha laid the ugly sliver on the crate beside the ledger, a small bright truth that caught the light. You thought you could starve a town and call it arithmetic, she said. The man gave a laugh that sounded like a cough that had run out of choices. Somewhere down tunnel, a boot scuffed. The lantern flame wavered. Brin's ears lifted. Adeline's hand found Martha's sleeve and squeezed once, not out of fear, but as if to remind both of them that they had already done the hard part. They had made the water honest. Whatever stood in the dark beyond the Ben badge or belly or both would have to argue with a stream that ran true in a chain of small, stubborn facts laid end to end. Time to go up, Martha said, her voice low. Time to put eyes on this, not just ours. She slipped the iron wedge into the oilcloth bundle, with the rubbings and the ledger-pressed wax at the fold, with the church seal Clara had given them to carry, and nodded to Finn. The deputy who had mistaken obedience for duty swallowed, then shouldered the bound gauge man up the ladder, one rung at a time. Brin went last, glancing back into the tunnel's throat, as if to promise the water he would return if it called. When Martha's hand closed the trap door, the shack breathed once, and the morning reached for them like a town reaching for itself. They came out of the shack with the gauge man roped and blinking, the morning wide and ordinary in that cruel way mornings have, as if the night had not tried to break anything at all. Brin trotted ahead, limping only enough to remind Martha of the strip she had torn from her shawl. The square felt larger than yesterday, as if the air had learned to carry more voices. Roar and Vein still sat tied at the church rail beneath the bell. their shadows short and mean on the steps. People moved like tide-knot haste, making space for Martha and Adeline and Finn, and the man who had tried to starve a town with a sliver of iron. Clara had turned the telegraph office into a kind of pulpit. Mr. Reed worked the key with a brisk patience, and Adeline stood over his shoulder, reading each line back aloud to the room before he sent it down the wire. To the governor's clerk, the words were plain and careful. Unlawful diversion of groundwater ledger in custody pipe stamps, bearing ELV and co-chain of custody, initiated citizens assembled. To the circuit judge writing the Southern Loop request for injunction on all marked works, request for officer to take charge sworn witness statements, forthcoming sabotage of public draw prevented at dawn. To the U.S. Marshal, 2 towns north, 2 men in custody, 1 sheriff and 1 merchant, request for federal hold third actor captured at Scene Community Garden Place. Martha laid the proof out on the church table the way a quilter lays her pieces before the needle ever tastes thread. The ledger sat in the middle, its neat columns suddenly loud. To one side she placed the charcoal rubbing of the pipe stamp ALV and Co. coming up thick and gritty on paper as if the coal itself were disgusted by the company it had been asked to name. To the other she set the rubbing of the tunnel map, the crude X marks and numbers that had been nothing more than math in a thief's hand and were now a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to the first lie. She put the iron wedge in the dish beside them, and next to that a short strap that still smelled faintly chemical from where it had pressed a wet seam. Adeline added her board's tidy sketches of the valve box and its little brass plate that read, Reservoir Authority Western Division. Finn, sweating through his shame, took the pencil and wrote a blunt account of his part. Every letter a square nail hammered into his own fence. People came with faces like rooms opening. Mrs. Kendrick's canteen tucked into her apron now, as if she had carried water all her life. The widow harnessed from the school board, arms full of paper. Old Mr. Tally, who had not crossed the square without a stick in 3 years, left the stick at home and leaned on 2 boys instead of 1 shoulder for each. A rancher named Yates, who had a voice that always sounded like sunset. The Harrow brothers, iron in their jaws. Children clustered like birds on a rail eyes. Big even when they tried to look bored, because boys in clusters always try to look bored. Adeline explained the chain of what and why in the same tone she used to teach reading. No big words wasted, no small facts lost. Martha spoke only when the room needed the feel of a thing, the sound of twine under pressure. The way a valve remembers how to turn if you grease it, then ask it kindly. Vane watched and seemed to get smaller without losing height. He tried once to catch an eye and sell something through it and found the market closed. Roar kept his grin like a nail in his lip. The gauge man stared at the floor with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. When Clara asked his name, he spoke it like a man giving up a pawn to save a queen. She wrote it neat on Adeline's list and left a blank line under it for the part where he would tell what else he knew, when telling became the only way to breathe clean. There was a moment when fear tried to return through a familiar doorway. A merchant from the far end of the square, a man who had not liked paying for anything twice in his life, cleared his throat and said, maybe the town could strike a bargain. Maybe Vane kept a reservoir we could borrow from now and repay later. Maybe suffering made people foolish, and negotiation made them smart. The words were not evil. They were small and tired, the kind people say when they want to go home and put the kettle on and call this a misunderstanding. Clara let him finish, and then said the line that pinned the day to the wall where no wind could shake it. When a thing belongs to all of us, she said, no. Man may sell it back to us at a price. The merchant swallowed and nodded, because it is hard to argue with a sentence that has been waiting exactly this long to be said out loud. By late morning, the telegraph began to answer itself. The first slip came off in Mr. Reed's hand, and he read it twice before he let it touch the table. The governor's clerk acknowledged receipt and instructed, preservation of all persons and papers, requested a sketch of the site. The names of witnesses sworn and advised that any county officer attempting removal without federal hand would be considered in contempt. The second bore the marshal's short grammar. Hold them. Keep rope and calm. Officer riding at once. The third carried the judge or a voice close enough to make the paper feel heavier. An injunction on all works bearing the stamp ELV and Co. in the county until inquiry order to the marshal to take charge of evidence and prisoners and a note in a more human script at the bottom that said simply, "Do not let the townsfolk go thirsty while I ride." You could feel the square draw a new breath. Not a cheer, not yet. Something steadier. Men and women began to sign their names on Adeline's paper under the line, "I saw, and I testify, and I will stand." The widow harness wrote in a hand so beautiful even Martha, who had never cared for flourishes, felt her throat pinch. Mrs. Kendrick signed and looked up at Martha as if relief were a new muscle that hurt the first time you used it. Old Mr. Tally made an X, and Adeline touched his wrist and wrote his name beside it, the way teachers do for hands that built fences instead of letters. Vane asked to speak. "Clara, because fairness is a habit, not a flavor, let him." He said commerce is the blood of progress, and sometimes a vein must be opened to feed a body. He waited for the laugh for the smart notice of Vane, and Vane in the same breath, but the square had spent too long counting ribs to care for wordplay. A child next to Martha whispered, "I do not like him," and another child said, "Shh," and everyone heard it, but no one scolded, because children often point with the cleanest finger. Brin drifted from shadow to shadow, like a little river, letting people lay their hands on his head as if he were the town's single soft thing. When he came back to Martha, he leaned harder than before, and she knew the limp had found him again after the climb and the work. She whispered his name, and he thumped once in answer, as if to say, "Stop worrying or do not stop if it makes you useful." Mr. Reed tapped the key once more to send a last short line to the judge's clerk, the sort of line that makes a far office understand a near urgency. Water steady at source, sabotage foiled, town holding, awaiting officer, children faint less today. When the line clicked back a simple received, it felt like a hand laid on a shoulder from farther away than most hands can reach. Adeline gathered the papers, squared their corners, and looked at Martha. "We are not done," she said, "but the worst part is over." Martha looked at the ledger, the wedge, the rubbings, the strap, the neat signatures rising down the page like a slow hymn, and thought maybe the worst part had been the year when no one looked at her long enough to see the shape of her. Now every glance felt like a stitch pulling her into the cloth. At noon the bell rang once, a single note that did not belong to funeral or wedding or fire. Clara said, "We eat, we drink, we keep the lanterns trimmed, and we wait for the marshal." Jacob and his brother changed the knots on Roar and Vane, as if tying up a load for a long haul. The gauge man sat on the church step and stared at his hands the way a man sometimes does when he realizes they are not innocent or useless, and he must decide which truth to live with. Martha poured Brin a dish of water, and then for the first time in a long time poured herself a second cup and drank it slowly. Not because there was plenty, but because there was enough to taste what it meant. They went back to the ridge before the sun had the chance to turn the slope brittle, not to fight, but to finish the thing they had dared to start. Adeline slung a board and charcoal across her back like a teacher going to war with a wall of lies. Martha shouldered the coil of hemp and tucked the sewing roll where it always lived, as if it were only a morning of mending. Finn walked half a step behind wrists, still bound eyes down, as if he were measuring the ground for all the steps he had taken in the wrong direction. Brin trotted with a small favoring of the left paw, the limp eased but honest. His nose read the air's quiet sentences and flicked once at every place the hill kept a secret. They did not go through the shack. They skirted it, shouldering into scrub and shale, following the lay of pipe by ear and fingertip, the way a rancher follows a fence line in fog. The ground told on the men who had worked it, scuffed patches where crates had been dragged, crushed weeds in a regular shape, a clean raw bite in the earth, where something long and narrow had been buried then lifted. Martha knelt and pressed her palm to a shallow ruin of metal, crossing a wash of dirt like a scar. The pipe lay so close to the skin here that even the morning could feel it. Adeline laid paper over the scar and rubbed. The coal came up in a blind path that curved like a snake looking for a cool stone. She turned the sheet and wrote small along the margin east saddle pipe, near surface witness Martha Adeline Finn. At a saddle cut low between two knuckles of hill, the pipe dived into a timbered box sunk into the slope. Martha worked the pry bar under the lid and leaned. Wood complained, then yielded with a soft groan that felt like a confession. Inside lay the throat of a valve so new it blushed brass, clean as a coin that had never changed hands. A small plate rode beneath the handle. Adeline bent with her coal, breathed slow, and brought up the letters on her paper until they stood there plain to any eye that could read Reservoir Authority Western Division, and below that, a number that would match a page somewhere in an office a day's ride away if a clerk's hand had kept honest hours. Above the plate, the stamp sat crisp ELV and Co. Not the faint ghost they had rubbed in the tunnel, but a boast pressed hard enough to be felt with a thumb. Martha rested her fingers on the handle and found it stubborn where stubborn should not live. She set the tiniest lick of lard to the threads and eased, not forcing, not pleading, just reminding the metal it knew how to move. When it swung an inch like a gate that never truly wanted to be stuck, she tore a thin strip from her handkerchief and tied it flat where the brass's motion was true, a visible mark that would tell any later hand what right felt like. Finn leaned in, pointing with his bound fingers to a notch cut like a sly mouth on the housing. "That's the wedge bed," he said, voice thin. "You slide the sliver in and the town side starves." He did not look at Martha when he spoke. Adeline nodded once and wrote notch for wedge on her page, then added a small square where witnesses could sign next to the word later, as if she meant to drag time itself to the table and make it tell what it saw. Farther along, where the ground began to crumble toward a dry gully, Brin stopped and sneezed at dust that had not settled quite right. He pawed once, glanced back at Martha, and nosed a sliver of stenciled wood peeking from scree. They dug with hands and crowbar and found 3 empty barrels keeled on their sides like fish left by a receding flood. The stencils still showed through scuff and grit, tallies painted in the same neat hand as the ledger's numbers, a rhythm that did not belong to chance. A coil of pipe straps lay half buried under a slab of shale. A crate of bolts with a paper invoice fused to one board by damp, and time the letters glued to wood in a stubborn marriage. Adeline coaxed what she could from it with a wet cloth enough to catch the ghost of an office stamp and a half name that could be read 2 ways. Martha lifted one strap to the light and wrinkled her nose at a chemical smell, nettling up from the metal's back, a tang like something boiled until it forgot what it had been. She wrapped a smear of the residue in wax paper and wrote the dumb, clean word smell in her tidy script. Then she added a line under it where that smell came from. "We'll have a name tomorrow," and signed her name over the promise, because promises work better when you see who will be asked to keep them. Near the foot of a scraggly cedar brine, pawed again, and unearthed a bolt with a sliver of red wax caught in its threads. Martha showed it to Adeline, and the teacher's mouth drew into a tight plane that meant the line would land hard when it came. "Some man stamped a seal on oil and called it authority," she said, and then smeared the same seal on metal so that anyone with eyes could follow the trail. "We will make that seal say a different thing in open daylight." She sketched the bolt and the wax in the margin, then lowered her pencil and looked at Finn. "Tell me if I am wrong about what you meant to do next," she said, and described in that calm, steady voice the routine of the nights he had served. "Wedge the east slit, set the valve a hair meaner than necessary, count to 30 barrels by the gauge, put a man on the ridge road to listen for any town that woke up enough to follow spin a story about a faint in Mrs. Whitmore's house to draw eyes away while wagons rolled behind the breaker's lot." Finn closed his eyes at his own diagram, returned to him and said there is nothing to correct. They marked each find with a small stake in a strip of rag, not because they thought someone would move the hill, but because haste makes men clumsy, and clumsy men kick truth into new shapes. Adeline wrote a list that could be read like a sentence, even if a wind blew the rest of the papers clear to Kansas. Valve box with plate ELV and co-stamp notch for wedge 3 barrels, pipe straps bolt with red wax invoice ghost. Under that, she left a blank where she would later add the names of the men and women who would be willing to say that they had seen these things with their own 6 senses, and not only with faith. When they finally turned back toward town, the sun had warmed but not hardened the light. From the crest, Red Hollow lay small and particular, a handful of right angles and smoke threads, and the white slash of the church where the bell hung like an old throat. It should have looked fragile from up there, Martha thought. Instead, it looked exact. The square held a shape that did not belong to fear or panic, but to people who had learned how to look in the same direction without breaking apart. Adeline touched Martha's elbow and said, 1 hour. We lay this down where it can be counted by more than us. Martha nodded, and the nod felt different than yesterday's nods, as if it were not only agreement, but also a piece of bone finding its socket again. They dropped into the lee of the hill, and it smelled like a thing saved. The church bell did not ring, but the air carried a tone that made Martha think of buckets passing hand to hand in a summer night when sparks flew, and men did not speak because the rhythm had to be kept. As they came into the square, children parted without giggle, and women made room with their hips the way they do when they are moving something heavy and want it not to bump. Jacob lifted his chin from where he stood over Roar and Vane and the gauge man, and his mouth did not smile, but it softened on one side in a way that meant he knew a necessary piece had been fetched. Clara had tidied the proofs into an order that a stranger would understand. The ledger sat in a lockbox with the church seal pressed into wax at two corners. The rubbings lay under a sheet of muslin that Adeline lifted only when she spoke, and then covered again as if to keep sun from fading the new truths before they could be presented to the man with the badge who would arrive. The paper strip from the telegraph sat tucked under a glass, alongside two more that had come while they were up the hill, one from the marshal saying, "Officer on road hold, all keep peace." One from the judge's clerk saying injunction, served at depot copies, writing with officer. Mr. Reed had written times beside each so that someday a child could point at the page and say, "Here is when we did not turn away." Martha set the strap and the bolt with its red wax sliver on the table and unwrapped the wax paper to let the smell breathe. A woman standing close shut her eyes and said, "That is the same tang I tasted in my kitchen when the pump coughed at dawn." Adeline wrote her name down and the words kitchen pump and dawn next to it, the way a ledger wicked up grain and turned it into a number. Brin slipped under the table's edge and made a small sound that was not a whine. It was an exhale, as if he too had been holding a piece of the hill up with his ribs and could finally set it down. No one cheered. That would have been a way to spend the feeling too quickly. Instead, Clara looked over the table, over the faces over the rope that still connected two men to a rail, and said only this: "We have enough, not more. Enough. We will not be baited into foolishness. We will not let the night claim what the morning made clear." The marshal is riding. The judge's clerk is riding behind him with papers that like to bite. We will light our lanterns and set a watch and hold. Jacob put two men at the well, as if it were a cradle. Mrs. Kendricks, you and the school board move the benches into shade and keep the little ones in songs. Mr. Reed, keep that wire warm until you see the dust of a federal horse. For the first time since she had found Brin in the rocks, Martha felt the ache in her throat loosen without water touching it. She bent and laid her hand along the dog's neck, and he leaned harder into her boot, a weight both small and absolute. Adeline slid a folded paper into Martha's palm, a copy of the rubbing of the plate, and the stamp, the kind of thing that fit beneath a bodice or into a prayer book, and would not be found by coarse hands unless they tore the dress from a woman who no longer feared their hands. Martha tucked it away and looked up, and the square looked back at her as if she had always been part of the way it held itself together. The afternoon set its shoulders under Red Hollow and lifted, as if a town could learn how to hold its own weight in plain daylight. The square arranged itself without shouting. Benches slid into shade. A table became a desk, then a counter, then a witness stand depending on whose hands were on it. Adeline ruled three neat columns on a large sheet, what was seen by whom and when, and pinned it with a nail to keep the wind from editing. Martha laid the strap, the iron wedge, the bolt with its red wax sliver, and the charcoal rubbings in an order that made sense to fingers as well as eyes. Brin curled under the table with the solemn air of a clerk who understood his role was to be steady and available. Clara set a tin of sealing wax beside the lockbox, heating the spoon over a lamp until the red ran like a small river. She pressed 3 seals into it, one by one, church council ranchers, then lifted them off with the care of a midwife. Each coin of wax caught the light. Each kept its sharp edges. Mr. Reed copied the morning's telegram replies onto a clean sheet in a hand, large enough for the porch watchers to read. He dated and timed every line. "The governor's clerk instructs preservation," he wrote. "The marshal rides. The judge enjoins all works bearing ELV and co-officer to take charge." Under that, he added town to hold peace. Swearing began slow the way rain does after a year of dust. The widow harness spoke of children fainting beside the pump and the sound a bucket makes when it hits a dry bottom, a small hollow insult to the ear. Mrs. Kendricks told the boy's story and the way fear fell off her like a shawl when she heard how water moved under the ridge. Old Mr. Tally said he smelled a sharp tang in his kitchen at dawn and tasted something boiled in the pump, the same tang that rose now from Martha's wax paper. Adeline wrote their words in the what, in the when, and signed their names with a dot when their hands shook. A rancher named Yates testified about barrels in the night and how horses walk different under a heavy sloshing load. Jacob Harrow, his brother at his shoulder, spoke in a low voice that carried, "I saw men try to set a town against itself, and I saw a town decide otherwise." Through it all, Vane watched in a shrinking kind of way, as if the square were a coat he had tailored for himself, and found to his surprise that it did not fit anymore. He tried to buy a look now and again, the way a man at a fair throws a coin at a rigged board, but the game had changed. Roar kept his grin like a nail-hammered crooked, unable to hold weight, but determined to stick out. The gauge man sat on the church step, wrists crossed in rope, and stared at his own hands. When Adeline called his name, he lifted his face. It was an ordinary face, the sort you forget as soon as you turn away, which made it harder to hate and harder to forgive. He cleared his throat and said, "I took numbers because numbers do not cry." Then he swallowed and added, "But the people they belong to do." He told the room about the wedge bed in the east slit and the routine set by men who signed with initials instead of names. He did not pretend to be a hero. He did not ask to be liked. Adeline wrote his account without trimming it into a prettier shape. A shopkeeper from the far end of the square tried again in his tidy voice to offer a bargain with the word reservoir hanging off it like a bow. Clara answered him with the same line as before, but this time she added a second sentence set down like a second nail near the first so the plank could not twist. "And if any among us sold his neighbor's share back to him for coin, she said he will come stand on these steps in daylight, and we will hear that too." The shopkeeper nodded, half relieved to be overruled. Mr. Reed took a short wire from a farmer 2 valleys east who had heard the judge's injunction read at the depot and was asking if the stamp ELV & Co. on his own windmill pipe meant he should stop drawing water. Adeline took the message and wrote a careful reply that said, "Do not starve your house. The injunction binds new work and sell not your kitchen. Keep notes. Save broken parts for the marshal. I will write you a plain explanation by tomorrow's train." She looked at Martha while the key clicked the words away. "A town is never just itself," she said. "It is also every ear that can hear it." The preacher came and stood without posture for a long minute, as if learning how to be a man in a crowd again. When he spoke, he did not lift his hands. "The truth does not need my fingers," he said. "It needs my witness." Then he stepped down and signed his name, and the square made a small, respectful noise like a throat clearing in a quiet room. Children collected details the way pockets collect smooth stones. One girl drew the valve box as Adeline described it. A boy traced the shape of Brin's ears and then the shape of the iron wedge and wrote under both hero without saying which one he meant. Martha sat to rest her leg and the bench filled around her without plan. Mrs. Kendricks on one side, a teamster on the other, a child asleep with her cheek on Martha's sleeve. The old ache at the base of Martha's throat loosened again, as if invisibility were a tight collar being cut free, stitch by stitch. Near mid-afternoon, a whisper ran from the north road like a small animal dust on the horizon. Men shaded their eyes. Women hushed the nearest children in the practiced way. That means something is coming, but we do not yet know which name it wants. Mr. Reed stepped to the telegraph and sent a single word to the marshal's office site, because brevity wears a badge well. The dust held the shape of 2 riders, not a posse and not a mob. The square did not cheer, it drew together. Before the shapes resolved or tried a trick, he must have practiced in his head while the town was busy with truth. He folded his knees, let his weight go slack, and pulled his wrists outward just enough to loosen a knot, the way a clever man loosens a tooth with his tongue until he can spit it in a hand and claim surprise. A deputy bent, a loop slipped. Roar's hand found a sliver of iron he had hidden under his cuff. He swung for the rope at Vane's wrists. Brin moved first. He did not bite. He simply put his body where the hand meant to go, as if he had been making that decision for hours and had only been waiting for the moment to arrive. Roar's knuckles hit dog and then dust. Jacob's boot found the loose rope and hauled it tight again. The sliver of iron lay a foot away, glittering meanly in sunlight until Martha stooped and picked it up between two fingers, like something that might sting. The square did not gasp. It exhaled in one piece. The town had learned the difference between panic and breath. The preacher said enough in the tone of a man done with a topic. The gauge man looked at Roar and then at the ground, as if measuring which sight would be harder to forget. Adeline wrote a brief line on the witness sheet, attempted tampering foiled by dog, and underlined it. Not because the law required it, but because children would read these papers someday and deserve the exact story. The dust on the road resolved into a badge and a writ. A deputy marshal, coat plain and star clean, and the judge's clerk riding behind with a ribbon tube tucked under his arm. They came at a trot that did not hurry itself into arrogance. The marshal swung down, folded his reins over the hitch, and lifted his hat just enough to show a brow made for listening. He took in the steps, the ropes, the table, the wax, the children with their pencil drafts of valves and dogs, and nodded to Clara as if they had been corresponding for years. "Ma'am," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore." She answered and handed him the lockbox with both palms. He set the box on the table and did the thing that told the square what kind of man he was. He did not ask for speeches first. He asked for the things. The wedge in Martha's hand, the strap with its chemical tang, the rubbings, the bolt with its red wax, the list, the signatures, Finn's statement, Adeline's sketches. He looked at each, not long, not cursory. He held the wedge the way a man holds a thorn he means to keep. He nodded to the clerk. "Read it," he said, and the clerk unrolled the writ like a man unties a good rope. The judge's words laid themselves into the dust and join: preserve, hold, deliver into federal hand. No county removal officer empowered to take charge. When the last syllable found its place, the marshal put his palm on the lockbox lid as if it were a shoulder. "This will ride with me and with you, Mrs. Whitmore, to the North Station. At first light," he said, "these two men will ride between us. This town will stand to watch us leave, and then this town will turn its hands to making water honest in the open. Tonight you light lanterns, you set a calm watch, and you do not let your anger talk you foolish. Foolish is the loose-bored men like these used to slip back through the wall you just repaired." Clara's chin dipped in agreement. Jacob reset the knots without flourish. Adeline squared her papers and slid one duplicate of everything into a second envelope that she sealed with the church coin, then pressed it into Martha's hands. "A second change," she said softly, "because men on roads get hungry for paper." Martha tucked it under her bodice where the fabric lay strong. Brin settled at her heel and sighed a dog's sigh that sounded to Martha like the town learning how to sleep without fear of waking to dry taps. The marshal turned to the well. He did not draw from it. He only laid his hand on the rope and closed his eyes for a breath, as if listening for the new steadiness. When he opened them, the light had shifted from hard to true. Evening came gentle over Red Hollow, and for the first time in months the air tasted faintly of something like rain, that was not yet rain, but a rumor of it, as if even the sky had decided to sign its name at the bottom of the day. Evening leaned into Red Hollow, and the town leaned back, matching its weight. Lanterns blinked alive one by one, first in windows, then along the square, then out by the well, where two benches became a watch post and a prayer without words. The marshal walked the perimeter once with Jacob, saying little, touching a knot. Here a rail, there, a hand on a boy's shoulder where Jitter wanted to turn into mischief. The judge's clerk copied the writ in a careful second hand and hung that duplicate on the church door with two tacks so no mouth could claim ignorance when morning came. Clara called the watch like she'd been doing it all her life. 4 lines on a board, names beside each a bell to pass from hand to hand at the change. Mrs. Kendricks and the widow Harness took the first hour at the well with 3 school children who knew enough numbers to mark the bucket's rise and fall. Mr. Reed set a small lamp by the telegraph in case the wire remembered something late. Adeline gathered the lists into neat bundles, then surprised no one by producing a kettle and the makings of thin tea from a basket that had not looked big enough to hide provisions and order both. Martha found herself still. Not idle hands, moving eyes working, but still in the way a loom is still when the shuttle is between throws. Brin slept with his head on her boot tail, thumping once whenever a step came close that did not belong to the square's own rhythm. The bandage along his flank had bled through at a corner. Martha freshened it with water and a whisper, and the small click of safety a tight knot makes when it knows it is right. You saved a town twice, she told him under her breath, once with your nose and once with your body. Brin made a sound that might have been a dog's laugh or only the way contentment moves in a throat. The well took on a new sound at dusk, steady then, steadier the rope, humming a low note when the bucket rose. Children stopped fainting. A woman who had not wept since the river turned to rumor put her hand over her mouth and let two small sobs out like birds, and no one minded. Adeline sat beside Martha on the church step and leaned shoulder to shoulder, the shared weight, a language they had been studying all day without knowing it. "This is what proof sounds like," she said softly. "Not the papers, the bucket. And this is what being seen feels like?" Martha answered, surprised. The words were hers. "It is heavier than I thought and kinder." Down the rail, Vane tried to find a seam in the evening. He called to a rancher by name, offered a memory and an offer braided together. The rancher looked past him the way men look past distant weather they are done predicting. Roar kept his grin, but it had lost the teeth that bite. Twice he asked for water, and twice the dipper came to his lips without spit in it. The third time he asked, Mrs. Kendricks herself held the dipper, and he drank, and she looked at him over the tin edge as if to say, "I am not doing this for you." He looked back as if to say, "I know." Sometimes a town becomes precise in the smallest exchanges. Near full dark, a scuffle of feet rose at the far end of the square. Not panic, but the kind of cluster that can turn. Two young men, no one claimed, and so everyone watched, had drifted toward the rope around the wagons. Voices pitched too high for honest talk. One had a spark in his pocket, the sort used to light a pipe when wind is mean. The spark kissed straw. The straw kissed air. A stingy smoke line drew itself along the wagon edge. Brin was standing before Martha's mind caught up. He barked once, a sound like a nail driven home, then let pause, beating at the straw until the ember died under his weight. Jacob's boot ground the last red fleck flat. The marshal stepped into the small emptiness that follows a near mistake and did not reach for a gun. He reached for the boy's wrists. "You will sit," he said. "You will listen to what a town sounds like when it lives. And tomorrow you will carry a bucket until your shoulders remember this night." They sat. Shoulders remembered soon. Clara brought the tin of sealing wax again, and with Adeline impressed a fresh coin on the second envelope, now tucked close to Martha's ribs. The church seal's cross and wheat stood clear. The wax cooled without a thumbprint. "Should anything go crooked on the road," Clara murmured, "this rides with you or without you to someone who can read." Martha's hand went reflexively to the spot where the packet lay. Odd, she thought, that paper could feel like armor. A fiddle tuned at the edge of the square found the first note of a hymn, and then thought better of it, settling instead on a small tune that walked beside the town instead of in front of it. People hummed if they knew how, and listened if they did not. The preacher stood with his hat in his hand and his head uncovered, not as a ceremony, but as a correction to a long mistake. Mr. Reed sent one more wire to the marshal's office. 4 words only at town holding. "Water steady." Adeline passed a cup to Martha. "Tea thin and strong as a promise you know you can keep." "Tomorrow," she said, "you and Clara ride to the station with the marshal. I'll stay and keep the buckets honest. The judge will hear you better if his desk already holds letters written by 10 witnesses in the same ink." Martha nodded. "I do not like leaving Brin," she admitted. "He belongs to the whole square." Adeline said, a smile in her voice. "He will be busy." They walked the watch once together the way women walk a house after guests have gone, hand on back of a chair, a finger along a windowsill, not to check for dust, but to let the room know it is still loved. At the well they found Mrs. Kendricks counting aloud with the smallest Harrow boy, his voice intent as a sparrow. At the telegraph, Mr. Reed and the clerk had devised a system for passing the key between them without losing a beat if a fresh message arrived while one of them ate. At the church rail, Jacob doled out a ration of jerky, not ungenerous, not foolish. Roar took his piece and said nothing. Vane took his and tried to say 3 things at once. None of them landed. Near midnight, a breath of air cooler than it had any right to be slid down off the ridge and across the square. It carried no wet, but it did not carry dust either. People lifted their faces like plants. Martha felt it on her cut finger, a small sting, then relief. Brin lifted his nose and made that sharp dog sneeze that announces a change. Somewhere far out of earshot, thunder had the decency to roll without promising anything. It was enough. Folks went on with their tasks lighter by a hair. Toward the last watch, Martha's body remembered beds and how they hold you. Adeline sent her to the church pew for an hour's sit that became a lean, that became a doze. She woke to Brin's chin on her knee and the sound of soft-talk Clara and the marshal low and practical agreeing on a route that kept them away from men who wore their hats like trouble. "We'll ride while the sun is kind," the marshal said. "With luck, we're on the noon train north." "With luck, we will not need luck," Clara answered. Martha looked past them to the door. The writ hung there, twin to the one in the lockbox, catching lantern light like a tame star. She thought of the trap door sighing of lard, slicking threads to kindness of a twine's flutter, settling when pressure remembers its manners. She thought of how a town had turned its face toward itself and recognized what it saw. Tucked under her ribs, paper warmed with her heat. Under her palm, Brin's breath counted time. Dawn did not rush. It arrived like a decision already made. The square lifted its lanterns one by one and pinched their flames closed. The well rope creaked in the good way. The marshal tightened a cinch. Clara buttoned her coat to the throat. Adeline pressed 2 folded sheets into Martha's hand. Names and notes neat as a spine. "Bring these back stamped," she said, not by a company, but by a court. Martha rose and the town rose with her, not to follow, not to leave everything to her, but to make a lane of faces and shoulders and open air. Brin stood and shook the night from his coat. Roar watched and chose silence. Vane watched and discovered he had nothing left to name. The road waited east, the station north of the judge's desk somewhere between. Red Hollow stood not brave in a trumpet way, but brave in a bucket way, steady, steady, steady. The first hoof stepped out of the square, and the town's breath went with it like a quiet tide turning. Dawn did not break so much as it unfolded careful, as if the sky had decided to handle Red Hollow the way a woman handles a cracked cup she refuses to throw away. The marshal saddled with motions that did not waste themselves. Clara buttoned her coat to the throat and tucked the duplicate packet flat beneath it. Martha checked Brin's bandage, the knot snugged the edges clean, then swung up on a mare whose ears flicked like questions and settled into answers. Roar and Vane were lifted onto the bench that Jacob had fashioned from an old bed frame, iron corners glinting, shame made practical. 2 ranchers took the rear rifles across their saddles, not pointed at anything, only present, in the way a fence is present when cattle think of roaming. They set off by the north road that kept to the long curve of the dry creek, not because it was the shortest, but because it offered the most places to see trouble before it tried a name. The square did not cheer. It made a lane of faces and quiet, and let the party pass as a river lets a leaf pass when it is serious about being a river. Adeline lifted a hand from the church step. Martha touched her own fingers to her brow in answer a small salute that would not have lived on her body a week ago. Brin trotted at the near stirrup pace, neat head high, not the swagger of a dog on a hunt, but the carriage of a clerk bearing an important envelope. For the first mile no one spoke. Feet and wheels found a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. The marshal's head turned now, and then not much, just enough to taste the wind with his eyes. Birds lifted from elder scrub in pairs. The creek bed held last year's story in a rattle of pebbles. Vane tried to set his shoulders to nonchalance and failed. His posture had learned too quickly what ropes feel like. Roar watched the horizon as if it were a bar. He knew the feel of better than any rope. "You think this ends with a letter and a ride?" Vane said at last, his voice polite around the metal in his wrists. "You'll find the world larger than your square. Men in offices eat problems like yours for breakfast and lick their plates." Clara answered without looking at him. "We brought more than a problem," she said. "We brought names and numbers and a town that can stand in daylight." The marshal did not add anything. He preferred the sound of hooves to the sound of a braggart trying to find a last purchase. 2 bends later, the world chose to test them. A wash opened on their right, a bite out of the hillside where the last real rain had chewed and left teeth marks. 2 riders eased out of it as if born there. Hats, low coats, plain horses muscled for work. Their hands sat too ready near their belts. Not hired killers, hired cowards, the kind who prefer uneven math. The marshal drew his horse a half step forward and set his voice to patient. "Mornin'," he said. "I will ask you to move your animals to either side, and then I will ask you to go home." The taller of the two spat into the dust and said, "You haul the wrong men." He let the word men ride out like he owned it. Brin bristled without a sound. Martha felt the prickle of the dog's thought through the stirrup leather and put a hand to his head because he was right. This was the moment when a lean story could fatten itself into blood. Roar twitched his shoulders as if to limber them for whatever foolishness he liked to name courage. Vane wet his lips, and for a blink, the mask of gleam and sermon slipped, showing a gambler's quick math. 2 against 5, plus a dog, plus a federal star. He opened his mouth anyway because men like him always think they can talk in extra troops if the speech is slick enough. The marshal did not reach for his gun. He reached for his badge, opened his coat enough to let the star breathe, then pointed with 2 fingers, lazy as a man naming clouds. "You will move," he said, "because there is only one way this morning ends if you do not, and it does not end where you prefer." The shorter rider's eyes snagged on the writ case tied to the wagon's rail. He saw the ribbon and paled like a man who suddenly remembers letters can bite. "I got no quarrel with paper," he said. The tall one hesitated. Brin stepped forward and fixed his gaze on the tall horse's knee with such unwavering interest that the animal shifted uneasy. Martha heard her own voice before she had time to practice it. "You can still be the kind of men your mothers thought you would grow into," she said, not scold, not plea, just fact. The line landed. The tall one stared at his hands as if surprised to find them attached to him in daylight. They turned out of the road without a speech and took their dust with them. The wash closed its mouth behind them. No one spoke for a while after that. Relief makes a sound if you know how to listen for it. The click of a horse finding his old slow walk, the way a wagon's squeak returns to its usual, the breath a woman lets out through her teeth when the thing on the ridge remains a ridge and not a wound. Brin shook once lightly and let his tail say what words would have made too big. The station sat where the tracks had taught the land to be straight. A water tower waited a wooden throat that would not be asked to lie. A telegraph office with a bench out front. A shade tree that had learned to wear grit as decoration. 2 men stood hats off as the marshal's party came in, the station agent, who could make a schedule read like scripture, and the town constable, whose badge looked sheepish beside the federal star, but did not leave his chest. The agent touched his cap. "Wire said to expect," he told the marshal. "Judge's second hand came through by night train and left you a docket." He said the words chain and custody 6 times 1 for each page. The marshal nodded, swung down, and took the lockbox from Clara's grip, as if passing a child from one parent to another. He set it on the agent's desk inside and broke the first seal with a thumbnail. Not for the theater of it, but for the math of it. Seal broken in officer's sight, contents checked, seal renewed. Adeline's duplicate documents came out crisp. The wedge gleamed stupidly on the wood. The agent wrote each item on a manifest with a pen that ate ink like a satisfied thing. Clara signed. The clerk signed. The marshal signed. Martha hesitated, then wrote her name in letters that did not tremble. "Witness," the agent said, writing the word beside her script. He stamped the page with a round office seal whose weight felt different under the hand than any private press. It thunked instead of clicked. It said public instead of purchase. Roar and Vane were transferred with less ceremony. Rope to iron, bench to car. The constable took Roar's elbow with a cousinly roughness that told a long story in one grip. Vane tried to turn his face to Martha as he passed the station door. "You could have taken my offer," he said, almost gentle, as if practicing a new voice for a different town. "You could have had more than a bucket of thank yous." Martha looked at him and felt nothing complicated. "You cannot bury water," she said. "You only drown yourself trying." For once, he did not have a sentence to answer with. He climbed into the car and the door shut, and the world did not applaud. When the train sighed and then sang its bright iron song, Martha felt the square's mourning gather itself inside her chest, even though the square was 2 hours behind her. Steam rose. The wheels took hold. The marshal touched the brim of his hat to Clara and then to Martha. 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. You'll have a deputy back with the judge's hand and a company of men who know one pipe from another. Clara nodded. The town will hold, she said. and we will not wait to start what we can start. They watched the cars diminish to toys and then to a line, and then to a thought you could fold and put away until it came back with an answer. Brin pressed his shoulder to Martha's knee, asking without words whether his work was done for the morning. Almost, she told him. One more stop. They took the south flank of the return, a slower road with fewer mouths to climb out of. The day grew honest hot, not the punishing sort, just the kind that makes wheat smell like what it is. At the ridge, they turned their horses aside and climbed the last bit on foot. The valve box lay where they had left it, the cloth strip tied to the handle exactly where Martha had knotted it, truth marked in fabric and grease. She put her fingers on the brass and felt the run beneath as steady as a sleeping child's chest. Adeline would be by the well, now she thought, counting bucket strokes with Mrs. Kendricks, and a boy whose numbers were getting better by the hour. Maybe the preacher would be teaching the children to read the witness sheets out loud, because reading your town turns out to be as important as reading your Bible. Maybe Mr. Reed was writing a letter to the farmer 2 valleys over to say, keep your windmill on the court-enjoined new theft, not your kitchen. Maybe Jacob had taken the gauge man's eyes off his hands and put them on a broom or a rope instead, because work is a better shackle than most iron. They stood there a minute, 3 figures and a dog, and listened to something no one in Red Hollow had heard in too long, water moving the same way it had when men were quiet. A hawk wrote a crooked sentence overhead. Brin sat, then lay, then rolled once for the joy of dust and the way it hugs you back. Clara laughed, a short sound that did not need company. Home, she said. It wasn't a question. Martha picked up the coil of hemp and tucked the sewing roll deeper into her pocket. Home, she agreed, and the word felt like a bucket set down whole after a long carry. The road back leaned downhill. When they topped the last rise, they could see the square small and exact, a map drawn by a careful hand. Lanterns gone out windows, open children running, not as if chased but as if called. The well rope moved like a metronome. The bell hung quiet but present. The line of people making a lane had dissolved into the work of ordinary day, which now included the extraordinary task of being a town that had refused to be sold to itself. Brin broke into a trot and then into a canter, forgetting his limp for 20 yards and remembering it without shame after. He reached the first fence and waited there, tail high, because he knew where the party ended and where the town began. Martha's eyes burned, and not from dust. She thought of all the words she had not said for a year, and all the water she had not drunk, and how both thirsts had gone quiet together. Behind her, the marshal's promise rode the rails. Ahead of her, a bucket rose and another and another. Between the two, a woman and a dog and a town carried something that had once been invisible into a day that knew its own name. The day settled over Red Hollow like a hand that meant comfort and not command. By noon, the square had returned to its new kind of ordinary lanterns, dark benches in shade, children trotting buckets without wobble, because the rope hummed steady. The telegraph clicked sometimes and sometimes fell to a quiet that no longer felt like abandonment. Adeline taught 2 boys to read the witness sheet out loud, their fingers keeping place beneath the lines, their voices sounding out words that would stay in their mouths long after the paper yellowed. Mr. Reed drafted a letter to the farmer 2 valleys over that began with, "Do not starve your kitchen," and went on to explain, plain as fence posts, how an injunction binds thieves and not mothers. Jacob set 2 men to trim the well housing and oil its pulley, as if it were a wheel before a long haul. The preacher carried a hammer for the first time in a while and used it without sermon. Martha stepped away from the bustle and sat on the church step, Brin's head heavy on her lap. She loosened the bandage, checked the edges, pressed fresh cloth, and tied it snug with the same care a woman uses on a baby's belly button the first week home. The dog's eyes went soft and serious the way grateful eyes go. She pulled from her pocket a strip of the old shawl she had torn the first night and stitched it into a narrow collar with her small needle, the one she trusted most. Her thread went in and out, quiet as breathing. When she was done, she slid the collar over Brin's head. She had sewn 4 letters into it with charcoal wash floss where only a thumb would feel them if it went looking. BRIN. The dog sneezed once, as if to acknowledge the new truth he was being asked to wear, then laid his chin back down and accepted it. Adeline came and sat beside her so their shoulders spoke. "The marshal will write when he reaches the North Station," she said. "And again when the judge puts his hand to the papers. The hard part is not waiting. It is not letting the waiting turn us cruel." Martha nodded. We have enough, she said, echoing Clara without meaning to. And we have what to do. Her gaze went to the square. Mrs. Kendricks had gathered the school mothers near the pump and was drawing a chalk line on a board. Above it, she wrote 3 words in a hand that had not been asked to write anything but lists for years' Water Watch Committee. Below that, names began to bloom, not from shaming, but from a clean wish to be counted where the counting mattered. Near mid-afternoon, a thrill ran along the wire and into Mr. Reed's hand. The marshal's office first train received at 11:47 prisoners in lockbox and custody ledgers, cataloged under public seal officer, detailed to return with judge's order. Then a second the judge's clerk, almost warm for an official message injunction, broadened to the whole district stamp ELV, and co-enjoined from sale, and new works officers empowered to seize contraband connections and restore lawful draw. A third briefest of all, and somehow the most human dog, brave town, brave, hold steady. Mr. Reed read them twice and then climbed onto a bench to read them again to the square, because reading is not the same when 2 ears hear it at once and 100 hear it together. A soft rattle of relief moved through the people like wind through prairie grass. It did not break into applause. It became work. Adeline pinned a fresh list to the church door. Names for a water board to be elected at sundown 3 seats and 2 alternates terms to last a year and then face the same daylight they had asked from others. Jacob, who had a gift for asking men to do what men did not know they wanted to do, walked to the gauge man and put a broom in his hands. Make yourself useful, he said. There was no kindness in the words, and there was no meanness either. The rope came off the man's wrists and went around a post. He swept until the sweepings made a tidy pile larger than his first hope. Finn, who had written his name under his blunt confession, stood with the preacher for a long while, and then went down to the well to learn the proper knot for the bucket strap from Mrs. Kendricks. He failed twice, and then tied it right, and the small pride that entered his face did not ask to be forgiven. It asked to be earned again tomorrow. Clara drew Martha and Adeline into the shade and spread a rough scrap of paper on her knee. We will put the cooperation in writing, she said, smiling a little at her own word. 1 well keeper from the schoolyard, 1 from the ranchers, 1 from the widows and laundresses, because those are the hands that know water's true weight. Every ledger line open to any pair of eyes that wants it. No barrel leaves this square without a mark on a public page. Adeline nodded and added a simple line at the bottom in her school fair hand. No man may sell back what belongs to all. We said it once. We will say it again. Martha, feeling the dangerous new ease in her chest that comes when a life begins to fit a person, said in a child's committee, 2 at a time by turns to count bucket pulls and take pride when the number is high and stand embarrassed when it is low, because embarrassment is a good teacher when it goes home with you for supper. Clara grinned outright. Write it, she said. Gee, Adeline did. Toward evening, a dust tail showed itself on the north road, as neat as if a finger had laid it down. The deputy marshal, who had ridden ahead of the judge's order, came alone at a lope that did not frighten animals. He swung down, handed Mr. Reed a ribboned envelope, and gave the square a look that took in everything and made no theater of its approval. The envelope carried the language of a court that knew how to be exact. Orders for seizure of marked pipe and fittings anywhere in the county authority for the marshal to deputize town watch to carry out the work in sight of the law schedule for a hearing 2 weeks hence in a room where benches will be clean and a clock will be honest. It included a line few had expected authority to form a temporary public water association under the judge's hand until the county could make a permanent frame for it. Adeline's mouth went round at that. Clara made no sound, but her hands flexed as if they had put down a weight and only then realized how long they had been carrying it. The work of unburial began the next morning and wore through the following 2 like good boots. Men and women in pairs of 1 from the town and 1 wearing the deputy's tin star, clipped to a vest, walked the gullies, and the ridge pried up box lids marked lengths of pipe with tags that said public hold, in Adeline's tidy letters, capped valved mouths with plaques the judge's clerk had brought that read under injunction. A boy with careful hands and a girl with a strong back went to each team to count and carry, and the sunlight turned their hair the same pale color, because impartiality loves simple metaphors. When the last strap and the last bolt lay in a row under the church eaves, Martha stood with her palm on Brin's neck and let the picture burn itself into her. A town could hang its own testimony on nails the way families hang tools they use every day. There were costs. A man whose cousin had worked for Vane, cursed twice and kicked a post, then stood red-faced while his wife took his hat and put it in his hands implacably until he remembered to hush. A barrel broke a finger. A child tripped and bloodied a knee and was for the first time in weeks offered water first and scolding second. The gauge man asked to write a letter to a sister in a far county. Adeline watched him write every word and sealed it herself. Finn hauled more than his share and went to bed without a story each of those nights. On the third evening, the sky, which had been practicing mercy in small breaths, tried a larger one. Thunder walked the ridge like a big cousin. Winds smelled like metal and green. The town did not run about like chickens. It looked up and it went about readying roofs and dragging boards over proper windows. When rain came, it came honest. No flash flood, no false start. Just a steady patter that entered the dust grain by grain until the dust accepted its new shape. People stepped out into it and lifted their hands. No one shouted. Brin stood in it, eyes half closed, and let the water find the new letters on his collar, as if the sky were practicing how to read. Martha went to the well with Adeline and Clara and waited her turn. The bucket came up shining and not ashamed. She dipped a tin cup, took a mouthful, held it on her tongue, like a promise swallowed. "You cannot bury water," she said, not for a crowd this time, not for a man who needed to be answered, but for herself as a line that would live in her throat when it needed to. Adeline set her cup down and nodded. "And when we write it down," she said, tapping the fresh ledger of the Water Association with the back of her knuckle, "we do not hide the ink." Sundown found the square full without pressure. The new board was named with more gratitude than applause. Roar and Vane were names inside a docket. Now not ghosts, not gods. The judge would sit them where they belonged soon enough. Martha, who had once lived as if the world had stepped to the other side of the street to avoid her shadow, found herself in the middle of the only lane that mattered, a lane made of neighbors making room for one another. She put her palm against Brin's cheek. He leaned into it, collar warm against her skin, rain soft in his fur. The bell did not ring. It did not need to. The town had already heard itself. The square breathed and kept breathing. Buckets went down and came up. A ledger lay open where anyone could lay a finger on a line and trace it to the truth it belonged to. Martha stood, and Adeline stood with her, and Clara stood too. All three like fence posts you trust because they took a storm and remained. Red Hollow had not become perfect. It had become exact. And in the exactness, there was room enough for hope to set down its own bucket and drink.